I'm Lisa Thompson, 45 years old, and I always believed that grief was something you learned to carry, not something that could be stolen from you. For 20 years, I mourned a son I thought died in a car accident. I kept his baby shoes in a memory box, visited an empty grave every Mother's Day, and let the weight of his loss shape every decision I made. But grief, I discovered, becomes something else entirely when you find out it was built on a lie, when you realize the person sleeping next to you every night knew your child was alive and chose to let you suffer anyway. The notification that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was grading second-grade math tests. My phone buzzed with an email from Ancestry DNA. "You have a new DNA match." I almost deleted it. I'd submitted my saliva sample 6 months earlier, hoping to trace my grandmother's Irish roots for a family tree project. What I found instead was a 99.9% parent-child match with someone named Dia Rodriguez in Portland, Oregon. The profile photo showed a young man with dark hair and eyes that looked exactly like mine at that age. Eyes I thought I'd never see again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The young man in the photo had my chin, my husband's broad shoulders, and a smile that made my coffee cup slip from my hands. His profile said he was 22 years old, born in Denver, Colorado. My son Daniel would have been 22 if he had lived past that terrible night when Mark told me our car had been hit by a drunk driver and our baby didn't survive. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, reading the limited information over and over. Rodriguez was looking for biological parents. He'd been adopted as a toddler and wanted to know his medical history. I called Mark immediately, my hands shaking so violently I could barely dial. He was at work handling insurance claims like he had for the past 15 years, and when he answered, his voice had that familiar distracted tone he used when he was busy. I told him about the DNA match, about the young man who looked exactly like our Daniel, about the impossible possibility that was staring at me from my laptop screen. The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was different, careful. He told me it had to be a mistake, that DNA tests weren't always accurate, that I was torturing myself by looking at adoption websites and grief support forums. He said he'd be home early and we'd figure it out together. But something in his tone made me screenshot everything before he could convince me to dismiss it. Something about the way he said "figure it out" instead of "prove it's wrong" made my stomach twist with a recognition I wasn't ready to name. I spent the rest of the day researching Rodriguez, whose full name I discovered was Daniel Rodriguez. He was studying mechanical engineering at Portland State University, played intramural soccer, and had posted photos of hiking trips that showed him surrounded by friends who clearly adored him. He looked happy. He looked alive. He looked exactly like the baby I'd held for 2 precious years before losing him forever. When Mark came home that evening, he found me sitting at our kitchen table with printouts spread across the surface. Photos of Daniel at graduation, Daniel with friends, Daniel holding what appeared to be an engineering award. Mark's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. First confusion, then something that looked like panic, then a forced calm that felt more terrifying than any explosion would have been. He sat down across from me and asked to see the DNA results again. He studied them with the same intensity he brought to fraud investigations at work, looking for discrepancies or errors that might explain away the impossible. I watched my husband of 25 years examine evidence that our son was alive, and somewhere in the careful way he held the papers, the measured way he breathed, I began to understand that this wasn't a shock to him, this was a problem to be managed. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that made me feel like I was falling through the floor of my own life. It wasn't surprise, it wasn't joy or confusion, or any of the emotions you'd expect from a father discovering his supposedly dead child was breathing somewhere in the world. It was resignation. The conversation that followed felt like watching my marriage dissolve in slow motion. Mark tried first to convince me that DNA tests could be wrong, that people could look similar by coincidence, that I was setting myself up for heartbreak by believing in impossibility. When I pressed him on why he seemed so calm about the whole thing, He told me he was trying to protect me from disappointment. When I asked him why Daniel Rodriguez had been born in Denver the same year our Daniel supposedly died, he said, it was a coincidence. When I asked him why he wouldn't help me contact the young man to find out the truth, he said, he couldn't watch me go through losing Daniel all over again. But I wasn't losing Daniel again. I was starting to suspect I'd never lost him in the first place. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I created a fake profile on social media and sent Daniel Rodriguez a message. I told him I might be related to him, that I'd gotten his information through a DNA website, and that I'd love to know more about his adoption story. I didn't tell him I thought I was his mother. I didn't tell him about the grave I'd been visiting for 20 years or the baby shoes I still kept in a box in my closet. I just asked if he'd be willing to share what he knew about his biological family. His response came back within hours. He told me he'd been searching for his biological parents since turning 18, that he'd been adopted through a private arrangement when he was 2 years old, and that his adoptive parents had always been honest about his origin. They'd told him his biological father had contacted them through a lawyer, explaining that his wife had suffered a severe breakdown after their son's birth, and that they felt adoption was the best option for everyone involved. The adoptive parents, Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, had raised him with love and openness, always promising to help him find his biological family when he was ready. I read that message sitting in my car in the parking lot of the elementary school where I taught, and something inside me cracked open like an egg. A severe breakdown after his birth. That part was true. I'd struggled with postpartum depression so severe that some days I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't hold my baby without crying, couldn't understand why motherhood felt like drowning when everyone said it should feel like flying. But I'd fought my way back to myself with therapy and medication and the fierce love I felt for my son. By the time Daniel turned 2, I was myself again. I was present, engaged, and desperately in love with my child. And then came the night Mark told me Daniel had been killed. The night that split my life into before and after. The night that made me believe I'd failed as a mother so completely, that the universe had taken my child away. I'd blamed myself for years, wondering if my early struggles with depression had somehow caused the accident, if my weakness had invited tragedy into our lives. Now I was beginning to understand that the tragedy wasn't an accident at all. It was someone had chosen to take my son away, and they'd used my mental health struggles as an excuse to justify the unjustifiable. I wrote back to Daniel immediately, asking if he'd be willing to meet in person. I told him I lived in Phoenix but could travel to Portland, that I had information about his biological family that might be important. I didn't tell him what that information was because I wasn't sure I could type the words without shattering completely. How do you tell someone you've been mourning them for 20 years? How do you explain that their biological father convinced you they were dead, while secretly arranging for them to have a different life with different people in a different state? Daniel agreed to meet. He suggested a coffee shop near his campus the following Saturday, and I booked a flight to Portland before I could change my mind. I didn't tell Mark where I was going. I told him I needed to visit my sister Jennifer in Seattle for the weekend, and the ease with which the lie came to me should have been my first clue that I was married to someone who'd been lying to me for decades. If Mark could let me believe our son was dead for 20 years, I could certainly let him believe I was visiting my sister for 2 days. The flight to Portland felt like traveling through time. With every mile that passed beneath the plane, I was moving closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted and a truth that would either destroy me or set me free. I'd brought the baby shoes in my carry-on bag, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed proof that I'd been a mother once. Or maybe I just needed something to hold on to when my world turned upside down. The tiny leather shoes had been Daniel's first pair of walking shoes, navy blue with soft soles, and I'd saved them because they'd seemed too precious to throw away. Now they felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own life. Daniel was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived at the coffee shop. He'd told me he'd be wearing a green jacket, but I would have recognized him anywhere. 20 years had changed the shape of his face and added height and muscle to his frame, but his eyes were the same eyes that had looked up at me from his crib every morning, the same eyes that had closed against my chest when he fell asleep in my arms. Seeing him alive and grown and real was like being hit by lightning and healed by it at the same time. I approached his table slowly, afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment like a soap bubble. When I introduced myself as Lisa, he stood to shake my hand, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to wrap him in my arms and never let go. We ordered coffee and made small talk about his studies, about Portland, about anything except the reason we were both there. But eventually the conversation found its way to the questions that had brought us together. Daniel told me more about his adoption, about growing up with the Rodriguez family in Portland, about always feeling loved but never quite feeling like he belonged. He'd inherited interests and talents that seemed to come from nowhere, a fascination with building things and taking them apart that neither of his adoptive parents shared. He'd always wondered about his biological family, especially after genetic testing revealed health predispositions that didn't match his adoptive family's medical history. When he'd decided to search for his biological parents, he'd hoped to find people who might help him understand where his interests and abilities came from. I listened to him talk about his life, about birthday parties and school plays and soccer games and graduations, and I felt 20 years of missed moments settling in my chest like stone. He told me about learning to drive, about his first girlfriend, about choosing his college major, about all the ordinary extraordinary moments that make up a childhood. I'd missed everything, every single milestone, every achievement, every scraped knee and broken heart and moment of triumph. While I'd been visiting an empty grave and torturing myself with guilt, my son had been growing up 2 states away, with people who'd loved him enough to give him everything I should have been there to provide. When he finished telling me about his life, he asked about his biological family. He wanted to know about genetic health conditions, about family history, about the circumstances that had led to his adoption, and that's when I had to make a choice that felt impossible. I could tell him the truth and destroy the story he'd been told about his origins, or I could continue the lie that had already stolen 20 years from both of us. I reached into my bag and pulled out the baby shoes, placing them gently on the table between us. "These were yours," I told him. "You took your first steps in them when you were 13 months old. You loved to walk around the living room holding onto the coffee table, and when you finally let go and took those first independent steps, you were wearing these shoes. I've kept them in a box in my closet for 20 years because I thought you were dead, because your father told me you'd been killed in a car accident when you were 2 years old, and I believed him because I had no reason not to." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Daniel stared at the shoes, then at me, then back at the shoe. I watched him process what I'd told him, watched him understand that the woman sitting across from him wasn't just. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just someone who might be related to him. I was his mother. The mother who'd supposedly had a breakdown and given him up for adoption was sitting right there, very much not broken, very much having been told a completely different story about what had happened to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked me to tell him everything I remembered about his first 2 years, about the night I thought he'd died, about the 20 years I'd spent believing he was gone, and I told him about holding him for the first time, about the way he used to fall asleep on my chest, about how he'd learned to clap and wave and say mama. I told him about the night Mark came home from what he said was a business trip, and told me there had been an accident, that Daniel had been with a babysitter when a drunk driver ran a red light, that our baby had been killed instantly. I told Daniel about the funeral I'd attended, about the tiny casket that I now realized must have been empty, about the grave marker that bore his name, and dates that should have marked the beginning and end of his life, but instead marked the beginning and end of the biggest lie I'd ever been told. I told him about the years of therapy, the medication, the way I'd rebuilt my life around a hole that I thought could never be filled. I told him about the Mother's Days when I'd sit by his grave and talk to him about what he might have been like, if he'd lived, never knowing that he was alive and growing and becoming exactly the person I'd imagined he might be. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting, his eyes never leaving my face, When I finished, he reached across the table and touched the baby shoes with one finger. He told me he had vague memories of a woman with kind eyes, who used to sing to him, memories that his adoptive parents had always assumed were fantasies or dreams. He'd never connected those memories to his biological mother because he'd been told that she'd been too unwell to care for him. Now he was beginning to understand that those memories were real, and that the woman in them was sitting right across from him. We spent the next 4 hours talking, sharing stories, filling in the gaps that 20 years had created between us. He showed me photos of his life, and I showed him photos of the life I'd built in the aftermath of losing him. I told him about the elementary school where I taught, about how working with children had been both healing and heartbreaking, about how I'd chosen never to have other children because I couldn't bear the thought of replacing him. He told me about always feeling like something was missing, about wondering why he had no baby photos or early childhood memories, about the questions his adoptive parents couldn't answer because they hadn't been there for his first 2 years. As the afternoon wore on, we both came to the same realization: someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had robbed us both of 20 years together. Someone had convinced him that his biological mother couldn't care for him while convincing me that he was dead. Someone had arranged for his adoption, staged his death, and maintained the lie for 2 decades. And that someone was Mark, the man I'd trusted with my life, my heart, and my grief, for 25 years. By the time we said goodbye that evening, we'd exchanged phone numbers and made plans to stay in touch. Daniel wanted to know more about his biological family, and I wanted to know everything about the life he'd lived without me. But first I had to go home to Phoenix and confront the man who'd stolen both of our histories. I had to face Mark and demand the truth about why he'd chosen to let me believe our son was dead, instead of simply asking for a divorce, if he thought I was unfit to be a mother. The flight home felt longer than the flight to Portland, weighed down as it was with the knowledge of what I'd have to do when I landed. I'd spent 20 years in a marriage built on the biggest lie imaginable, and now I had to decide what to do with that truth. Part of me wanted to walk into our house and destroy everything Mark had built on the foundation of my grief. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and disappear the same way he'd made Daniel disappear. But mostly I just wanted to understand why. Why had he chosen this particular cruelty? Why had he let me suffer for 20 years when he could have simply told me he wanted our son to have a different life? Mark was waiting for me when I got home Sunday night. He'd made dinner and set the table with our good dishes, and for a moment, I felt like I was looking at a stranger who'd been wearing my husband's face for 25 years. He asked about my trip to Seattle, about how Jennifer was doing, about whether I'd had a good time. I answered his questions while studying his face, looking for signs of the man who could arrange for his own son's fake death and maintain the charade for decades. But he looked exactly like himself: kind, familiar, trustworthy. The man I'd fallen in love with in college, the man I'd married, the man I'd grieved with and rebuilt my life alongside. That's when I understood that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones told by strangers. They're the ones told by people who love you enough to know exactly how to break you, and careful enough to do it in ways that look like protection. Mark hadn't destroyed my life out of malice. He'd destroyed it out of a twisted kind of love, the kind that believes it knows what's best for you better than you do. And somehow that made it worse. I sat across from Mark at our dinner table, the weight of what I knew pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. The salmon he'd prepared was perfectly seasoned, the wine he'd chosen was my favorite vintage, and the candles he'd lit created the same romantic atmosphere we'd enjoyed for 25 years of marriage. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the fact that I now knew my husband had spent 2 decades lying to me about the most fundamental truth of my existence. Our son was alive, and Mark had orchestrated an elaborate fiction to keep me from knowing it. I picked at my food while Mark talked about his day at the insurance office, about a particularly complex fraud case he was investigating, about the weekend plans he thought we might make together. His voice carried the same warmth and familiarity it always had, the same slight rasp that had attracted me to him in our college literature class all those years ago. He looked concerned when he noticed I wasn't eating, reaching across the table to touch my forehead and ask if I was feeling well. The tenderness in his gesture made my stomach turn because I recognized it as genuine. Mark loved me. Mark had always loved me, Mark had destroyed my life out of love, which somehow made the betrayal more devastating than if he'd done it out of hatred. After dinner, Mark suggested we watch a movie together, something light and familiar that might help me relax after what he assumed had been a stressful visit with my sister. I agreed because I needed time to figure out how to approach the conversation that would end our marriage, and possibly my ability to function as a rational human being. We settled onto our couch, the same couch where I'd nursed Daniel as a baby, where I'd cried for months after thinking I'd lost him, where Mark had held me through the worst grief of my life while knowing it was based on a lie he'd created. Mark chose a romantic comedy we'd seen a dozen times before, something starring Meg Ryan that usually made me laugh. Instead, I found myself studying his profile in the flickering light from the television screen, searching for signs of the man who could orchestrate such an elaborate deception. His face was the same face I'd woken up next to for 25 years, lined now with age and worry but fundamentally unchanged. His hands were the same hands that had held mine during Daniel's supposed funeral, that had rubbed my back during panic attacks, that had signed whatever legal documents had been necessary to fake our son's death and arrange his secret adoption. Halfway through the movie, Mark fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, and I sat there listening to his breathing while my mind raced through 20 years of memories that now felt contaminated by his deception. Every anniversary of Daniel's death when Mark had taken time off work to be with me. Every Mother's Day when he'd brought me flowers and sat quietly while I cried. Every Christmas when he'd suggested we donate toys to charity in Daniel's memory. Every single gesture of comfort and support had been performed by a man who knew our son was alive and thriving in Portland, who could have ended my suffering with a single phone call but chose instead to maintain an elaborate performance of shared grief. When the movie ended, Mark stirred awake and smiled at me with the same sleepy contentment he'd shown for decades. He suggested we go to bed, and I followed him upstairs while my mind continued cataloging all the ways he'd reinforced the lie over the years. The sympathy cards he'd helped me respond to after Daniel's supposed death, the grief counseling sessions he'd attended with me, sitting beside me while I sobbed about my failure as a mother to a therapist who had no idea the entire foundation of my pain was fabricated. The way he'd gently discouraged me from having other children, saying he thought it would be too painful for me to risk losing another baby. I lay in bed beside my husband that night listening to him sleep while I stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of what he'd done. Mark hadn't just lied to me once and then been trapped by the consequences. He'd actively maintained and reinforced the deception for 20 years. He'd watched me blame myself for Daniel's supposed death, had held me while I cried about being a failed mother, had supported me through therapy designed to help me accept a loss that had never actually occurred. Every day for 20 years, Mark had woken up next to me and chosen to continue the lie rather than tell me the truth. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the Phoenix Public Library, where I spent hours researching public records and adoption laws, trying to understand how Mark could have arranged Daniel's fake death and secret adoption without my knowledge or consent. What I discovered was both illuminating and terrifying. In 1995, when Daniel would have been adopted, private adoptions were less regulated than they are now. If Mark had claimed I was mentally unstable and unable to care for our child, if he'd had documentation of my postpartum depression, and perhaps some fabricated evidence of my unfitness as a mother, he could have arranged the adoption without my consent while I was supposedly recovering from the trauma of losing our son. The genius of Mark's plan became clearer as I read more about the legal processes involved. By telling me Daniel had died, Mark had eliminated any possibility that I might try to interfere with the adoption or seek custody of my own child. Dead children don't need to be visited or legally protected from unfit mothers. Dead children can't be traced through DNA websites or adoption registry. Mark had chosen the one lie that would be impossible for me to investigate or disprove, at least until technology advanced enough to make genetic testing widely available. I found myself thinking about the timing of Mark's deception, about how carefully he must have planned every detail. My postpartum depression had been severe but temporary, lasting only a few months after Daniel's birth before responding well to treatment and therapy. By the time Daniel turned 2, I was completely recovered and deeply bonded with my son. But those early months of struggle had given Mark the documentation he needed to paint me as an unfit mother,
and the timing of Daniel's supposed death had coincided perfectly with a period when I was healthy enough to grieve, but not suspicious enough to investigate. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where I'd been visiting Daniel's grave for 20 years. The headstone was small and simple, bearing his name and the dates that supposedly marked his brief life. I'd chosen the inscription myself, something about angels and love that had seemed appropriate for a child taken too soon. Now I stood looking at the granite marker and felt a rage so pure and overwhelming that I had to lean against a nearby tree to keep from collapsing. This grave was empty. This entire section of my life, this ritual of grief and remembrance that had shaped my identity for 2 decades, was based on nothing but Mark's elaborate lie. I thought about all the Mother's Days I'd spent here talking to Daniel about what he might have been like if he'd lived. I'd told his headstone about the children I taught, about how much I loved them but how they could never replace him. I'd brought flowers on his birthday and Christmas, had kept him updated on family news and world events, had maintained a relationship with a dead child while my living son grew up believing his biological mother had abandoned him due to mental illness. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its completeness. Standing in that cemetery, I realized that Mark's betrayal extended far beyond lying to me about Daniel's fate. He'd stolen my identity as a mother, convinced me I was too damaged to have other children, and built our entire marriage on the foundation of my manufactured grief. Every major decision we'd made together had been influenced by the supposed loss of our son. We'd moved from Denver to Phoenix partly to escape the memories of the accident that had never happened. We'd chosen not to have other children because I believed I couldn't survive losing another baby. We'd structured our entire life around accommodating my grief for a child who was alive and well and living in Portland. That evening I returned home to find Mark cooking dinner again, humming while he prepared what appeared to be an elaborate meal. He'd set the table with our wedding china and opened a bottle of champagne, and when he saw me come in he smiled with genuine warmth and told me he'd wanted to do something special since I'd seemed so stressed lately. The thoughtfulness of the gesture combined with my knowledge of what he'd done to me created a cognitive dissonance so severe that I felt like I was losing my mind. How could the same man who'd destroyed my life with such calculated cruelty also be the man who remembered exactly how I liked my pasta sauce and always bought me flowers when I was feeling sad? During dinner, Mark asked about my day off, whether I'd been able to rest and feel better. I told him I'd spent time thinking about our life together, about the choices we'd made and the direction we were heading. He seemed pleased by this, interpreting my words as evidence that I was moving past whatever emotional crisis had been troubling me. He talked about a vacation he'd been planning for us, a trip to Italy we'd discussed taking for our upcoming anniversary. He'd already researched hotels and restaurants, had mapped out an itinerary that included all the places I'd mentioned wanting to see. His excitement was genuine, his love for me unmistakable, and I sat there listening to him plan our future while knowing that our marriage was already over. After dinner, Mark suggested we sit on our back patio and watch the sunset, something we'd done regularly throughout our marriage. Our backyard was Mark's pride and joy, meticulously landscaped with desert plants and comfortable seating areas where we'd spent countless evenings talking about our days and our dreams. I followed him outside and settled into the chair where I'd sat for 20 years watching Arizona sunsets while believing my son was buried in a Denver cemetery. The familiar ritual felt surreal now, like performing a play where I was the only person who didn't know the script had changed. Mark poured wine and began talking about the insurance fraud case he'd been investigating, a complex scheme involving staged accidents and false medical claims. He spoke with the same righteous indignation he always showed when discussing people who deceived others for personal gain, the same moral clarity that had attracted me to him in college when he'd talked about wanting to help people and make the world more honest.
The irony was so profound that I found myself laughing. A sound so unexpected and bitter that Mark stopped talking and asked what was funny. I told him I was just thinking about how complicated people could be, how someone could seem completely trustworthy while hiding enormous secrets. Mark nodded thoughtfully and said that was exactly what made his job so challenging, that the best fraudsters were often the people who seemed most honest and reliable. They built their deceptions on kernels of truth, he explained, and maintained them through consistent behavior that reinforced the lie. The most successful con artists, Mark said, were those who convinced themselves that their lies were necessary and justified, who genuinely believed they were protecting the people they were deceiving. As Mark continued talking about the psychology of deception, I realized he was essentially describing his own methodology for maintaining the lie about Daniel's death. He'd convinced himself that his deception was necessary to protect me from my own mental illness, that taking Daniel away had been an act of love rather than betrayal. He'd maintained the lie through consistent behavior that reinforced my grief, had built our entire marriage on the foundation of a tragedy that existed only in my mind. Mark was the most successful con artist I'd ever encountered because he'd convinced himself he was saving me even as he destroyed me. That night, I lay in bed listening to Mark sleep while I planned how to confront him with what I knew. Part of me wanted to wake him up immediately and demand explanations, to scream at him about the 20 years he'd stolen from me and Daniel. But another part of me was terrified of what would happen once I spoke the truth out loud, once I shattered the illusion that had been sustaining our marriage for 2 decades. As long as I kept Daniel's existence to myself, I could still pretend that Mark was the man I'd thought he was, that our love was real even if it was built on lies. But Daniel deserved better than my cowardice, and I deserved better than a marriage based on deception. Somewhere in Portland, my son was living his life without knowing that his biological mother had spent 20 years mourning him, believing she'd failed him so completely that he'd been taken from the world entirely. Daniel had grown up thinking his biological mother was too mentally ill to care for him, while I'd grown up believing I was too damaged to deserve another chance at motherhood. Mark's lie had poisoned both of our lives, had stolen experiences and relationships and truths that could never be recovered. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee while Mark was still sleeping. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop, looking at photos Daniel had posted on social media, trying to memorize the life he'd lived without me. There were pictures of him at high school graduation, at college orientation, at various milestones and celebrations that I should have been present for. His adoptive parents appeared in many of the photos, clearly loving and devoted people who'd given him everything I would have wanted him to have. But their presence in his life didn't diminish the fact that my absence had been manufactured by my own husband. When Mark came downstairs, he found me crying over my laptop, and his first instinct was to comfort me. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and asked what was wrong, his voice filled with the same gentle concern he'd shown throughout our marriage. I leaned into his embrace for a moment, allowing myself to feel the safety and warmth I'd always found in his arms, knowing it would be the last time I'd ever trust him enough to accept his comfort. Then I turned around in his arms and looked directly into his eyes, searching for some sign that he was ready to tell me the truth. Mark's expression shifted when he saw whatever was in my face, moving from concern to weariness, to something that looked almost like relief. For a moment I thought he might confess without my having to confront him directly, that he might finally choose honesty after 20 years of deception. But instead, he asked if I was having trouble with my anxiety again, if I thought I should call my therapist or adjust my medication. The suggestion that my emotional state was the problem, that my distress was a symptom of mental illness rather than a rational response to discovering an enormous betrayal, made me understand that Mark had no intention of voluntarily telling me the truth. I stepped out of his arms and told him I needed to ask him something important, something that would determine the future of our marriage. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, his face carefully neutral, and waited for me to speak. I could see him preparing himself for whatever conversation was coming, could almost watch him accessing the mental files where he kept his explanations and justifications for 20 years of lies. His calmness in the face of what he surely knew was coming made me realize that Mark had been expecting this confrontation for a long time, had probably rehearsed his responses to every possible scenario. I reached into my purse and pulled out a printed photo of Daniel from his social media profile, the one where he was holding his engineering award and smiling directly at the camera. I placed it on the table between us and watched Mark's face as he looked at our son for the first time in 20 years. The expression that crossed his features was so complex that I couldn't parse all the emotions contained within it, but I saw recognition, guilt, fear, and something that might have been love or might have been regret. Mark stared at the photo for a long time before looking back at me, and in that moment I saw him make the choice between continuing the lie and finally telling the truth. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 20 years of deception finally being acknowledged. He didn't ask where I'd gotten the photo or how I'd found Daniel. He didn't try to convince me it was a coincidence or a mistake. Instead, He simply said the words that confirmed what I already knew but had been hoping against hope weren't true. "Daniel is alive," Mark said quietly. "He's been alive this whole time, and I'm the reason you didn't know." The words hung in the air between us like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. "Daniel is alive. He's been alive this whole time, and I'm the reason you didn't know." Mark's confession settled into my bones with the weight of 20 years of stolen time. 20 years of manufactured grief, 20 years of believing I was a mother whose child had been ripped away by tragedy when the real tragedy was sitting across from me at our kitchen table, looking exhausted by the burden of his own life. I stared at my husband while he stared at the photo of our son, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy with all the conversations we should have had over the past 2 decades, all the truths that should have been shared, all the moments that had been built on a foundation of deception so elaborate that I was still struggling to comprehend its scope. Mark looked older than his 47 years in that moment, worn down by the weight of maintaining such an enormous lie for so long, and I found myself wondering how many times he'd almost told me the truth over the years, how many moments of weakness he'd overcome to protect his carefully constructed fiction. When Mark finally looked up from the photo, his eyes held a mixture of relief and terror that told me he'd been both dreading and longing for this moment. I could see him gathering himself to explain, to justify, to make me understand why he'd chosen to destroy my life rather than simply ask for a divorce if he thought I was unfit to be a mother. But I held up my hand to stop him because I wasn't ready to hear his explanations yet. I needed him to understand the full scope of what he'd done before he tried to minimize it with justifications and excuses. I asked Mark if he remembered the night he'd told me Daniel was dead, if he could recall sitting on our couch in our Denver apartment while I screamed and collapsed and begged him to tell me it wasn't true. I asked him if he remembered holding me while I cried so hard I couldn't breathe, if he remembered driving me to the emergency room because I'd started hyperventilating and couldn't stop. I asked him if he remembered the funeral, the tiny casket, the way I'd thrown myself across the grave when they tried to lower it into the ground. Mark's face crumpled as I spoke, and I could see that he did remember, that every detail was etched into his memory as clearly as it was etched into mine. But where my memories were saturated with genuine grief and trauma, his memories carried the additional burden of knowing it was all performance, all carefully orchestrated theater designed to sell me a lie so profound that it would reshape my entire identity. Mark had held me while I grieved our supposedly dead son while knowing exactly where Daniel was, who was caring for him, how he was thriving in his new life. I told Mark about the years of therapy, about the medication I'd taken to manage the depression that had consumed me after losing Daniel, about the way I'd blamed myself for his death because I'd been struggling with postpartum depression when he was supposedly killed. I described the guilt that had eaten away at me for decades, the certainty that my mental health struggles had somehow invited tragedy into our lives, the way I'd punished myself by refusing to have other children because I believed I didn't deserve another chance at motherhood. Mark tried to interrupt several times, to explain that he'd never intended for me to blame myself, that he'd tried to convince me the accident wasn't my fault, but his protestations only made me angrier because they revealed how little he understood about the psychological damage he'd inflicted. By creating a fictional car accident, Mark had given me a tragedy to process but no way to process it healthily. I couldn't visit the scene of the accident because it didn't exist. I couldn't sue the drunk driver because there had been no drunk driver. I couldn't find closure through normal grief processes, because the entire foundation of my loss was fabricated. I asked Mark to explain the mechanics of his deception, to walk me through how he'd arranged Daniel's fake death and secret adoption. I needed to understand the level of planning and coordination that had been required, the number of people who had been involved in maintaining the lie, the legal and logistical challenges he'd overcome to steal my son and convince me he was dead. Mark looked uncomfortable with my questions, as if discussing the technical aspects of his betrayal was somehow more invasive than admitting to the betrayal itself. Mark began his explanation slowly, reluctantly, like someone confessing to a crime they'd convinced themselves wasn't really criminal. He told me that the plan had started forming during the worst period of my postpartum depression, when I'd been struggling to bond with Daniel and had sometimes said I thought he might be better off without me. Mark had taken those moments of vulnerability, those dark thoughts that many mothers experience but rarely voice, and used them as evidence that I was genuinely unfit to care for our child. The first step had been documenting my mental health struggles in ways that would support his narrative. Mark had encouraged me to see therapists and psychiatrists, had insisted I try various medications, had created a paper trail that painted me as severely mentally ill and potentially dangerous to our son. When I'd started to recover and had wanted to reduce my medication or stop therapy, Mark had convinced me that I needed to continue treatment for Daniel's sake, that the responsible thing was to ensure I was completely stable before reducing my support system. While I'd been focused on getting better, Mark had been quietly consulting with lawyers about his options for removing Daniel from my care. He'd learned that proving a mother unfit required substantial documentation and often lengthy court proceedings, but that private adoptions could be arranged much more quickly and quietly if both parents consent. The challenge was getting my consent, which led Mark to develop the elaborate fiction of Daniel's death as a way to remove him from my life without requiring my legal cooperation. Mark had identified the Rodriguez family through a private adoption agency that specialized in placing children with families who couldn't conceive naturally. Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez had been trying to have children for years, had gone through multiple failed fertility treatments, and were eager to adopt a healthy toddler. More importantly, they were willing to relocate from Denver to Portland as part of the adoption arrangement, ensuring that Daniel would be far enough away to minimize the risk of accidental encounters that might expose the deception. The logistics of faking Daniel's death had required Mark to forge documents, bribe officials, and coordinate with several accomplices who had been paid to maintain their silence. The death certificate had been created by someone Mark knew through his insurance work, someone who had access to official forms and understood how to make fraudulent documents appear legitimate. The funeral home had been run by a man Mark had met through a fraud investigation, someone who was willing to stage a funeral with an empty casket in exchange for Mark's silence about certain irregularities in his business practice. The supposed car accident had been carefully crafted to explain why there was no body to view, why the casket had to remain closed, why the details of the crash were vague and inconsistent. Mark had told me that Daniel had been so severely injured that he was unrecognizable, that seeing him would only traumatize me further, that it was better to remember him as he had been. Every detail had been designed to prevent me from asking questions that might expose the deception, to keep me focused on grieving rather than investigating. During the months following Daniel's supposed death, Mark had maintained contact with the Rodriguez family through a lawyer who served as an intermediary. He'd received regular updates about Daniel's adjustment to his new home, photos of his development and milestones, reassurance that he was thriving with his adoptive parent. While I'd been struggling to survive the worst grief of my life, Mark had been following our son's progress like a distant relative keeping track of family news. The cruelest part of Mark's confession was learning that he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing for everyone involved. He'd convinced himself that I was too mentally unstable to be a good mother, that Daniel would be better off with parents who could provide him with stability and consistency. He'd told himself that letting me believe Daniel was dead was kinder than forcing me to live with the knowledge that my child was thriving without me, that the fiction of tragedy was more merciful than the reality of abandonment. Mark had rationalized his deception by focusing on the positive outcomes it had produced. Daniel had grown up in a loving home with parents who adored him. I had eventually recovered from my depression and built a meaningful life as a teacher. Our marriage had survived and even flourished in some ways, freed from the stress of parenting a child with a mother Mark believed was fundamentally unfit. In Mark's mind, his lie had created better lives for everyone involved, even if it had required me to endure years of unnecessary grief. But as Mark continued his explanation, I could see cracks appearing in his conviction, moments where he seemed to recognize the magnitude of what he'd done and the impossibility of justifying it. He admitted that there had been times over the years when he'd almost told me the truth, moments when my pain had become so overwhelming that he'd questioned whether maintaining the lie was really the kindest option. He'd written letters confessing everything and then burned them, had picked up the phone to call me from work and then hung up before dialing, had started conversations that might lead to the truth and then steered them in safer direction. The weight of maintaining such an elaborate deception had taken its toll on Mark as well, though his suffering seemed insignificant compared to what he'd put me through. He'd lived in constant fear of discovery, had monitored my internet usage and social media activity to ensure I didn't accidentally stumble across evidence of Daniel's existence. He'd discouraged me from visiting Denver or maintaining friendships that might lead to uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of Daniel's death. He'd shaped our entire life around protecting his lie, making decisions based not on what was best for us, but on what was safest for his secret. Mark told me that he'd been terrified when DNA testing became widely available, knowing that genetic genealogy sites posed a significant threat to his carefully maintained fiction. He'd tried to discourage me from participating in ancestry research, had suggested that digging into family history might be emotionally triggering, given our law. When I'd submitted my DNA sample anyway, Mark had spent months in a state of anxiety, checking my email and monitoring the testing company's website to see if any concerning matches had appeared. The irony was that Mark's attempts to control and monitor my life had become so habitual that he'd continued them long after they were necessary for maintaining his deception. He'd been checking my internet history and email for 20 years ostensibly to protect his secret, but really because the behavior had become compulsive. Mark had become so accustomed to surveilling and manipulating me that he'd lost track of where protecting his lie ended and controlling my life began. As Mark finished his explanation, I realized that the man I'd been married to for 25 years was essentially a stranger. The Mark one thought I knew was kind, honest, supportive, and trustworthy. The real Mark was manipulative, deceptive, controlling, and capable of inflicting psychological torture on the person he claimed to love most. Every quality I'd admired about my husband had been either fabricated or corrupted by his willingness to maintain such an enormous lie for such an extended period. The conversation that followed Mark's confession was unlike any we'd ever had in our marriage. For the first time in 25 years, Mark was being completely honest with me, and the honesty was more devastating than any lie could have been. I learned that he'd never really believed I was unfit to be a mother, that his concerns about my mental health had been exaggerated to justify his desire to have Daniel raised by different people. I learned that he'd chosen the Rodriguez family, partly because they reminded him of the kind of parents he thought Daniel deserved, but mostly because they were willing to cooperate with his elaborate deception. Mark admitted that his decision to take Daniel away had been motivated more by his own fears than by genuine concerns about my fitness as a mother. He'd been terrified by my postpartum depression, not because he thought it made me dangerous but because he didn't understand it and couldn't control it. Mark had spent his entire life trying to manage and fix problems, and my mental health struggles had presented him with a situation that couldn't be solved through planning and coordination. Rather than learn to support me through my recovery, he'd chosen to eliminate the source of stress by removing our child from the equation. The revelation that Mark's betrayal had been driven by his own weakness rather than my unfitness was somehow more painful than if he'd been responding to genuine concerns about my mental health. I could have understood, if not forgiven, a decision made out of legitimate fear for our child's safety. But Mark had destroyed my life because he'd been uncomfortable with my vulnerability, because he'd preferred the fiction of tragedy to the reality of supporting his wife through a difficult period. I asked Mark if he'd ever considered simply asking for a divorce, if he'd ever thought about legal separation, or custody arrangements that would have allowed him to protect Daniel without convincing me our son was dead. Mark looked genuinely confused by the question, as if the idea of honest communication about his concerns had never occurred to him. He told me that he'd been afraid I would fight him for custody, that I would use my recovery from depression to argue that I deserved to keep Daniel, that a court might side with me despite his documentation of my mental health struggle. Mark's answer revealed the depth of his contempt for me, his certainty that I would prioritize my own desires over Daniel's welfare, his assumption that I would be too selfish or delusional to recognize my own limitations as a mother. He'd never given me the opportunity to prove him wrong because he'd been convinced that his assessment of my fitness was more accurate than my own. Mark had appointed himself judge and jury in a case where I'd never been allowed to present a defense, had sentenced me to 20 years of grief based on evidence I'd never been permitted to examine. The conversation continued for hours, with Mark providing details and explanations that only deepened my understanding of how thoroughly he'd betrayed me. I learned that several people had been involved in maintaining the deception, including Mark's mother Carol, who had known Daniel was alive but had agreed to support the fiction of his death because she'd believed Mark's assessment of my mental state.
I learned that my own sister Jennifer had suspected something was wrong but had been convinced by Mark that questioning the circumstances of Daniel's death would be harmful to my recovery. The web of complicity that had enabled Mark's deception extended far beyond what I'd imagined, encompassing family members, friends, and professionals who had all chosen to protect Mark's lie rather than challenge it or investigate its validity. Some had been deceived themselves, believing Mark's carefully crafted narrative about my mental instability and the tragic accident that had claimed our son. Others had suspected the truth but had been convinced that maintaining the fiction was kinder than exposing it, that my psychological well-being was more important than my right to know the truth about my own child. By the time Mark finished his confession, the sun had set and our kitchen had grown dark around us. We'd been talking for over 6 hours and I felt emotionally and physically drained by the magnitude of what I'd learned. Mark looked equally exhausted, his face drawn and pale, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the glass of water he'd been nursing throughout our conversation. For 20 years he'd carried the weight of his deception alone, and finally sharing it seemed to have aged him decades in a single day. I told Mark that I needed time to process what he'd told me, that I couldn't continue living in the same house with him while I figured out what to do with the information he'd shared. Mark seemed to understand that our marriage was over, that no amount of explanation or apology could repair the damage he'd done, but he asked if I would consider couples therapy or mediation as a way to work through the aftermath of his confession. The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. The idea that therapy could address 20 years of systematic deception and psychological manipulation. Mark also asked about Daniel, whether I planned to tell him the truth about his supposed death and the circumstances of his adoption. I realized that Mark was terrified not just of losing me, but of losing control over the narrative he'd constructed around Daniel's childhood. If Daniel learned that his biological mother had never given him up willingly, that she'd been told he was dead while he was growing up, believing she'd abandoned him due to mental illness, it would destroy the carefully maintained fiction that had protected Mark's secret for 2 decades. I told Mark that Daniel deserved to know the truth about his origins, that he had the right to understand why he'd been separated from his biological mother, and what had really happened during his first 2 years of life. Mark argued that the truth would be devastating for Daniel, that learning about the deception would damage his relationship with his adoptive parents and potentially destroy his psychological stability. But I could see that Mark's concerns were really about protecting himself from the consequences of his actions, not about protecting Daniel from painful truth. The conversation ended with Mark asking what he could do to earn my forgiveness, what steps he could take to repair the damage he'd done to our relationship. I told him that forgiveness wasn't something he could earn through actions or gestures, that the magnitude of his betrayal had fundamentally altered who he was in my eyes, and made it impossible for me to trust him again. Mark had proven himself capable of maintaining an elaborate deception for decades, of watching me suffer without offering relief, of prioritizing his own comfort over my basic right to know the truth about my own life. That night I packed a suitcase and drove to a hotel near the elementary school where I taught. I needed space to think, distance from the life I'd built with Mark, time to figure out how to move forward with the knowledge that everything I'd believed about my marriage and my identity as a grieving mother had been based on lies. I sat in my hotel room staring at photos of Daniel on my phone, trying to reconcile the smiling young man in the pictures with the baby I'd held and loved for 2 years before losing him to Mark's elaborate fiction. The next morning I called my principal and requested a leave of absence, explaining that I was dealing with a family emergency that would require my full attention for the foreseeable future. I didn't tell her that the emergency was discovering that my supposedly dead son was alive, that my husband had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had stolen 20 years of my life, that everything I'd thought I knew about my own story was wrong. Some truths are too large and strange to share with people who haven't lived them. I spent the rest of the day making phone calls and sending emails, reaching out to lawyers and therapists and anyone who might be able to help me navigate the legal and emotional challenges ahead. I needed to understand my options for reconnecting with Daniel, for addressing the fraudulent documents Mark had created, for protecting myself from further manipulation and deception. Most importantly, I needed to figure out how to rebuild my life on a foundation of truth rather than lies, how to reclaim my identity as Daniel's mother after 20 years of believing I'd failed him completely. The lawyer I hired specialized in cases involving fraudulent adoptions and parental rights violations, and when I sat in her office 3 days after Mark's confession, I felt like I was describing someone else's life. Margaret Chen listened without interruption, as I explained how my husband had faked our son's death, arranged his secret adoption, and maintained the deception for 20 years. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and told me that in 30 years of practicing family law, she'd never encountered a case quite like mine. Margaret explained that the legal challenges ahead would be complex and emotionally draining. Mark had committed multiple felonies, including fraud, forgery, and filing false documents with government agencies. The death certificate he'd created was a federal crime, as was the conspiracy to defraud me of my parental rights. But pursuing criminal charges against Mark would require me to relive the trauma of his betrayal in court, to have my mental health history scrutinized by defense attorneys, to potentially damage Daniel's relationship with his adoptive parents who had acted in good faith throughout the adoption process. More complicated was the question of my legal relationship with Daniel. The adoption had been processed using fraudulent documents, and without my genuine consent, which meant it could potentially be challenged in court. But Daniel had lived with the Rodriguez family for 20 years, had been raised by them as their son, and had legal and emotional ties to them that couldn't be easily severed. Any attempt to reclaim my parental rights would have to balance my desire for a relationship with Daniel against his need for stability and his existing family bond. Margaret advised me to focus first on establishing contact with Daniel and allowing our relationship to develop naturally before pursuing any legal remedies. She suggested that forcing a legal resolution might damage my chances of building a genuine connection with my son, that Daniel needed time to process the truth about his origins before being asked to navigate complex legal proceedings. The most important thing she emphasized was ensuring that Daniel felt supported and protected throughout the process of learning about his history.
I left Margaret's office with a legal strategy that felt both overwhelming and inadequate. The law could address the crimes Mark had committed and potentially restore my legal rights as Daniel's mother, but it couldn't give me back the 20 years I'd lost or repair the damage that had been done to all of our lives. Justice, I was learning, was not the same thing as healing, and healing was what Daniel and I needed most. That afternoon, I drove to Portland to meet with Daniel again. We'd been exchanging texts and phone calls since our first meeting, and I could sense his confusion and anger as he processed the truth about his adoption. He'd confronted his adoptive parents about the story they'd been told regarding his biological mother's mental health, and they'd admitted that they'd always wondered if the circumstances of his adoption had been entirely truthful. Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez had loved Daniel unconditionally, but they'd also suspected that something was wrong with the narrative they'd been given about his origins. Daniel met me at the same coffee shop where we'd first encountered each other, but this time he looked exhausted and angry rather than curious and hopeful. He'd spent the past week researching adoption fraud and parental rights, trying to understand how his entire life history could have been built on lies. He'd also been struggling with conflicting emotions about his adoptive parents, whom he loved deeply but who had participated in separating him from his biological mother without fully understanding the circumstances. We talked for hours about the complexity of his situation, about how to navigate relationships with multiple sets of parents who had all been affected by Mark's deception. Daniel expressed anger not just at Mark, but at the entire system that had allowed such an elaborate fraud to succeed for so long. He felt betrayed by everyone who had known or suspected the truth, but had chosen to protect Mark's lie, rather than investigate its validity or consider its impact on the people it was designed to deceive. Daniel also struggled with questions about his identity and belonging that had no easy answers. He'd grown up as Daniel Rodriguez with parents who'd loved and supported him, but he was also Daniel Thompson with a biological mother who'd grieved for him for 20 years. He felt torn between loyalty to the family that had raised him and curiosity about the family he'd been taken from, uncertain how to honor both relationships without betraying either one. I assured Daniel that he didn't have to choose between his families, that loving his adoptive parents didn't diminish his connection to me or vice versa. But I could see that he was struggling with the emotional weight of having two mothers who both loved him, two sets of parents who had both been victims of Mark's manipulation in different ways. Daniel needed time and space to process his feelings without pressure from anyone to prioritize one relationship over another. Over the following weeks, Daniel and I began building a relationship that was entirely new despite being rooted in biology and history. We couldn't reclaim the mother-son dynamic we'd had when he was a toddler, but we could create something different that acknowledged both the connection we'd shared and the separate lives we'd lived. Daniel told me about his childhood, his interests, his dreams and fears, while I shared stories about the woman I'd become during the years I'd thought he was gone. The process of getting to know my adult son was both wonderful and heartbreaking. I could see traces of the baby I'd known in his expressions and mannerisms, but I also had to accept that most of who he'd become had been shaped by experiences I hadn't shared. Daniel had inside jokes with his adoptive parents, memories of family vacations I hadn't been part of, relationships and achievements that had nothing to do with me. Learning to celebrate his happiness while mourning my absence from it was one of the most difficult emotional challenges I'd ever faced. Daniel also introduced me to Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, who were struggling with their own complex emotions about the situation. They'd raised Daniel with love and intention, had given him everything they had to offer, but they were also grappling with the knowledge that their joy had been built on someone else's tragedy. Carmen broke down crying when she met me, apologizing over and over for taking my son even though she'd had no way of knowing that I'd never consented to his adoption. The Rodriguez family had been deceived almost as thoroughly as I had been, told that Daniel's biological mother was severely mentally ill and unable to care for him, that the adoption was necessary to protect his safety and well-being. They'd been shown fraudulent documentation of my supposed unfitness, had been convinced by Mark's lawyers that they were rescuing a child from a dangerous situation. Learning that they'd been manipulated into participating in an elaborate kidnapping had shattered their sense of themselves as ethical people who'd acted with good intention. Miguel and Carmen had also grown to love Daniel as their own son, which meant that any legal challenge to the adoption would threaten their family as much as it might restore mine. They found themselves in the impossible position of wanting to support my relationship with Daniel while also protecting their own parental rights and their son's emotional stability. The situation required a level of cooperation and generosity that seemed almost superhuman given the circumstance. Gradually, we all began to understand that Daniel's situation didn't have to be a zero-sum game where one family's gain required another family's loss. Daniel could have relationships with both sets of parents, could honor both the biology that connected him to me and the love that connected him to the Rodriguez family. Creating this new family structure would require patience, flexibility and a willingness to prioritize Daniel's needs over everyone else's desires for clarity and control. The legal proceedings against Mark moved slowly through the court system, complicated by the jurisdictional issues involved in crimes that had been committed across state lines over multiple decades. Mark hired expensive lawyers who argued that he'd acted out of genuine concern for Daniel's welfare, that my mental health history supported his assessment of my fitness as a mother, that prosecuting him would serve no useful purpose since Daniel had thrived with his adoptive family. The defense strategy seemed designed to put me on trial rather than Mark, to suggest that his deception had been justified by my supposed inadequacies as a parent. But as the case proceeded, evidence emerged that contradicted Mark's claims about his motivations and methods. Investigators discovered that Mark had been researching adoption procedures and consulting with lawyers months before my postpartum depression had reached its worst point, suggesting that his plans to remove Daniel from my care had been premeditated rather than reactive. They also found financial records showing that Mark had paid substantial sums to various people involved in creating and maintaining the fraudulent documents, indicating that his deception had been carefully orchestrated rather than hastily improvised. The most damaging evidence came from Mark's own communications with his co-conspirators, emails and text messages that revealed his real motivations for taking Daniel away. Rather than expressing concern for our son's welfare or my mental health, Mark's messages focused on his desire to escape the responsibilities and complications of parenthood, his belief that raising a child would interfere with his career advancement and personal freedom. The picture that emerged was of a man who had used my temporary vulnerability as an excuse to abandon his family while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted husband and grieving father. Mark eventually agreed to plead guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, but his legal troubles were far from over. The fraud he'd committed had affected not just me and Daniel but also the Rodriguez family, the adoption agency, and various government offices that had processed his false documents. Civil lawsuits followed the criminal case, with multiple parties seeking damages for the harm caused by Mark's elaborate deception. The divorce proceedings were less complicated but equally emotionally draining. Mark had no realistic hope of challenging my petition or claiming any moral high ground in the dissolution of our marriage. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed 25 years earlier had been based on false information about our family circumstances, making it legally void. Mark was also facing significant legal expenses and potential financial judgments from the various lawsuits against him, which meant that dividing our assets was more about protecting what remained than fighting over who deserved what. Throughout the legal proceedings, I continued building my relationship with Daniel and gradually integrating into his extended family network. The Rodriguez family welcomed me with a generosity that still amazes me, understanding that their love for Daniel was enhanced rather than threatened by his connection to me. We celebrated his 23rd birthday together, all of us crowded around a restaurant table that should have felt awkward but instead felt surprisingly natural. Daniel graduated from college with a degree in mechanical engineering, and I sat in the audience next to Miguel and Carmen, all of us crying with pride as he walked across the stage. After the ceremony, Daniel introduced me to his friends as his biological mother, and I introduced Miguel and Carmen as his parents, and somehow the distinction felt both important and irrelevant. What mattered was that Daniel was surrounded by people who loved him, that his life was rich with relationships and possibilities, that he'd grown into a remarkable young man despite the traumatic circumstances of his early childhood. I also began the difficult process of rebuilding my own identity around the truth rather than the lies that had shaped my life for so long. I returned to teaching after taking a semester off, but I found that my relationship with my students had changed. I'd always been drawn to working with children partly because of my grief over losing Daniel, and now that grief had been replaced by joy over reconnecting with him. I was still passionate about education, but my motivations were different, cleaner, based on genuine love for children rather than attempts to fill a void that had been artificially created. Therapy became an essential part of my healing process, helping me understand the ways that Mark's deception had affected not just my relationship with Daniel but my sense of myself as a woman, a mother, and a person worthy of love and honesty. I'd spent 20 years believing that my mental health struggles had somehow caused my son's death, that my weakness as a mother had invited tragedy into our lives. Learning to forgive myself for vulnerabilities that had been exploited rather than character flaws that had caused harm was one of the most challenging aspects of my recovery. I also had to learn how to trust my own perceptions and judgments after discovering that my reality had been systematically manipulated for decades. Mark's gaslighting had been so subtle and consistent that I'd lost confidence in my ability to distinguish truth from fiction, to recognize when I was being deceived or manipulated. Rebuilding that confidence required me to examine every assumption I'd made about my life and relationships, to question narratives I'd accepted without investigation, to develop new standards for evaluating the trustworthiness of the people around me. The process of healing was neither linear nor predictable. Some days I felt strong and empowered, grateful to have discovered the truth and reconnected with Daniel regardless of how painful the journey had been. Other days I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been stolen from me, furious about the time and experiences that could never be recovered, devastated by the realization that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. But gradually I began to understand that healing didn't require me to forgive Mark or to minimize the harm he'd caused. It required me to build a new life based on truth rather than fiction, to create relationships founded on honesty rather than manipulation, to trust my own strength and wisdom rather than depending on others to define my reality. Mark had taken 20 years from me, but he couldn't take my future unless I allowed him to. Daniel and I now talk regularly, sometimes about practical matters like his job search and graduate school applications, sometimes about deeper questions related to identity and family, and the ways that trauma can be both inherited and transcended. Our relationship is different from what it would have been if we'd never been separated, but it's also strong and genuine in ways that surprise both of us. We're learning to be family again, not in the way we were when he was a toddler, but in a new way that acknowledges both our shared history and our separate journey. The Rodriguez family has become part of my extended family as well, connected to me not just through Daniel but through our shared experience of surviving Mark's deception. Carmen and I have developed a friendship based on our mutual love for Daniel and our shared commitment to supporting his happiness and success. Miguel has become someone I can talk to about the challenges of parenting an adult child, about how to offer support without being intrusive, about how to love someone while respecting their independence. I've also reconnected with other family members and friends who were affected by Mark's lies, people who had suspected something was wrong but had been convinced to stay silent or who had been deceived along with me. My sister Jennifer admitted that she'd always felt something was off about the circumstances of Daniel's supposed death, but had been afraid to voice her concerns because Mark had convinced her that questioning the story would be harmful to my mental health. Other friends and relatives had similar stories of doubt and confusion that had been suppressed in the name of protecting me from additional trauma. The ripple effects of Mark's deception had extended far beyond our immediate family, affecting everyone who had cared about us and had been forced to participate in maintaining his elaborate fiction. Learning about the scope of his manipulation helped me understand that I hadn't been uniquely gullible or naive in believing his lie. Mark had been skilled at identifying and exploiting people's desire to be helpful and protective, turning their compassion into weapons against the people they were trying to support. Today, nearly 2 years after discovering that Daniel was alive, I'm building a life that feels authentic and sustainable in ways my previous life never did. I've moved to a smaller house closer to the school where I teach, a space that reflects my actual preferences rather than accommodating Mark's need to maintain appearance. I've developed new friendships with people who know my real story, who understand the complexity of my situation without trying to simplify or resolve it. Daniel visits regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with Miguel and Carmen, who have become unlikely allies in creating a new kind of family structure. We're all learning how to navigate relationships that don't fit traditional categories, how to love and support each other without competing for primacy or control. It's messy and complicated and sometimes emotionally exhausting, but it's also honest in ways that feel revolutionary after decades of living within Mark's carefully constructed lie. I've started speaking publicly about my experience working with organizations that support adoption reform and parental rights advocacy. My story has resonated with other people who have experienced various forms of family-related deception and manipulation, who have discovered that their understanding of their own lives was based on lies told by people they trust. There's a surprising number of us, people whose families have been shaped by secrets and deceptions that seemed designed to protect but actually caused immense harm. The work feels meaningful in ways that teaching, as much as I love it, never did. I'm helping to change systems and policies that enabled Mark's deception, advocating for reforms that would make it harder for similar frauds to succeed, supporting other families who are dealing with the aftermath of discovering fundamental lies about their origins and relationships. It's not the life I would have chosen, but it's a life that feels purposeful and authentic. Mark was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, though he'll likely serve less time due to good behavior and the nonviolent nature of his crime. I don't visit him or maintain any contact, having decided that my energy is better spent on building new relationships than trying to repair irreparably damaged ones. I'm not interested in his apologies or explanations, having learned that understanding his motivations doesn't diminish the harm he caused or obligate me to forgive him. Sometimes people ask me if I regret discovering the truth, if ignorance might have been easier than knowledge. The question always surprises me because it suggests that living within a lie could ever be preferable to living with truth, however painful. Mark's deception didn't just steal my relationship with Daniel, it stole my agency, my ability to make informed decisions about my own life, my right to grieve and heal and grow based on actual rather than manufactured experience. Discovering that Daniel was alive didn't erase 20 years of pain, but it did give that pain meaning and context that transformed it from senseless tragedy into comprehensible injustice. I can work with injustice, can fight it and learn from it and help others avoid it. Tragedy, especially the kind I thought I'd experienced, offers no such possibilities for action or meaning-making. Daniel recently got engaged to a woman named Sarah who teaches kindergarten in Portland, and he asked if I would help plan the wedding along with Carmen and his future mother-in-law. The request felt like both an honor and a challenge, an opportunity to participate in one of his most important life events, and a reminder of all the celebrations I'd missed during his childhood. But it also felt like a kind of healing, a chance to be present for his future even though I'd been absent from his past. As I write this, I'm sitting in my garden on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and pink. It's the kind of peaceful moment I rarely experienced during my marriage to Mark, when my days were structured around maintaining routines designed to accommodate his deceptions and my supposed fragility. Now my time is my own, filled with relationships and activities that reflect my actual interests and values rather than serving someone else's agenda. In a few hours, Daniel will call to update me on his wedding planning and to ask my opinion about flowers or music or some other detail that might seem trivial but feels momentous to me. Every conversation we have, every decision he includes me in, every moment we share is a gift that I never expected to receive. I can't reclaim the 20 years that were stolen from us, but I can treasure the years we have ahead, building new memories on a foundation of truth rather than lie. The story isn't over, of course. Daniel and I are still learning how to be family, still navigating the complex dynamics of our unusual situation, still discovering new ways that Mark's deception continues to affect our lives and relationships. But we're doing it together with honesty and patience and a commitment to supporting each other's healing and growth. Sometimes the best revenge against someone who tried to destroy your life is simply refusing to stay destroyed, choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage they created, finding ways to transform their intended cruelty into unexpected grace. Mark wanted to eliminate the complications and responsibilities of fatherhood, while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted family man. Instead, his deception created a family structure that's more complex and challenging than anything he was trying to avoid, but also more honest and resilient than what we had before. I'm not grateful for what Mark did to us, and I'll never minimize the harm he caused or suggest that his betrayal led to positive outcomes that justified his action. But I am grateful for my own strength, for Daniel's resilience, for the Rodriguez family's generosity, for the possibility of building authentic relationships even after experiencing profound deception. Most of all, I'm grateful to be living within the truth of my own life, however complicated and painful that truth might be. The courtroom was packed the day Mark was sentenced, filled with journalists, legal observers, and advocacy groups who had followed our case with intense interest. I sat in the front row between Daniel and Carmen Rodriguez, surrounded by the family we'd all learned to create together in the aftermath of discovering the truth. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over the entire proceedings with careful attention to detail, looked down at Mark with an expression that mixed disgust with professional composure. Mark stood before her in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled behind his back, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen him during our 25 years of marriage. The confident, controlling man who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception seemed to have collapsed under the weight of his exposed crimes, leaving behind someone who looked almost pathetic in his obvious fear and regret. But I felt no sympathy for him as the judge began reading the charges and explaining the reasoning behind her sentencing decision. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the unprecedented nature of Mark's crimes, the calculated cruelty required to maintain such an elaborate deception for so long, and the devastating impact his actions had on multiple families across multiple states. She noted that Mark had shown no genuine remorse during the proceedings, that his defense had focused on justifying his actions rather than acknowledging their harm, that he seemed to view himself as a victim of circumstances, rather than the architect of a massive fraud that had destroyed lives and relationships. When the judge announced Mark's sentence of 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but no amount of punishment could restore the 20 years that had been stolen from Daniel and me, could repair the trauma that had been inflicted on everyone who had been caught in Mark's web of deception. The sentence felt both too harsh and too lenient, adequate recognition of his crimes, but inadequate compensation for their consequences. Mark turned to look at me before being led away by the bailiffs, and for a moment our eyes met across the courtroom. I tried to read some message in his expression, some final acknowledgement of what he had done to us,
but all I saw was self-pity and confusion. Even facing the consequences of his actions, Mark seemed unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of harm he had caused, unable to understand why his elaborate lie hadn't been appreciated as the protective gesture he still believed it to be. After the sentencing, Daniel and I walked out of the courthouse together into the bright Phoenix sunshine, followed by reporters who shouted questions about our plans and our feelings about the verdict. We ignored them and climbed into Carmen's car, where Miguel was waiting to drive us to lunch at a quiet restaurant where we could process what had just happened without media interference. The legal chapter of our story was finally closed, but the emotional and relational work of rebuilding our lives was far from finished. Over lunch, Daniel talked about his conflicted feelings regarding Mark's punishment, his struggle to balance anger about what had been done to us, with recognition that Mark's imprisonment wouldn't undo the damage or restore what had been lost. Daniel had grown up believing his biological father was someone who had made difficult decisions out of love and concern, and learning that Mark had actually been motivated by selfishness and control had shattered his understanding of his own origins in ways that were still affecting his sense of identity and belonging. Carmen and Miguel shared their own complicated emotions about the sentencing, their relief that justice had been served balanced against their ongoing guilt about having unknowingly participated in Mark's deception. They had raised Daniel with love and intention, had given him everything they had to offer, but they continued to struggle with the knowledge that their family had been built on someone else's stolen child, that their joy had come at the cost of my devastation. I found myself thinking about forgiveness as we sat around that restaurant table, about whether Mark deserved any consideration or compassion, despite the enormity of his betrayal. Part of me wanted to hate him completely, to feel nothing but rage and satisfaction at his punishment. But another part of me recognized that holding on to anger would only continue to give him power over my emotional life, would keep me trapped in the past rather than free to build a future based on the relationships and possibilities that his exposure had created. The conversation turned to Daniel's upcoming wedding, which had become a source of joy and anticipation for all of us despite the complex family dynamics it represented. Sarah, his fiancée, had embraced our unusual situation with remarkable grace and understanding, welcoming both me and the Rodriguez family into her own extended family network without trying to simplify or categorize our relationship. She understood that Daniel's story was complicated, that his family structure didn't fit traditional patterns, but she loved him enough to navigate that complexity without demanding that he choose between his various parents and relatives. Planning the wedding had become an exercise in creating new traditions that honored all of Daniel's family connections, while respecting the boundaries and comfort levels of everyone involved. We had decided that both Carmen and I would walk him down the aisle, that both families would host separate pre-wedding celebrations, that the ceremony itself would acknowledge his complex origins, without dwelling on the traumatic circumstances that had separated and reunited us. The process had also forced all of us to confront questions about identity and belonging that extended far beyond our specific situation. What makes someone a parent? How do you honor multiple family loyalties without betraying any of them? How do you create inclusive celebrations that acknowledge complex histories without being overwhelmed by them? These weren't just practical wedding planning challenges, they were fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and the ways that families can be created and sustained even under extraordinary circumstances. As the wedding date approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point, the series of discoveries and revelations that had transformed me from a grieving mother into someone with a living son and an extended family structure that defied conventional categories. The path had been painful and often overwhelming, but it had also led to relationships and experiences that I could never have imagined during the darkest periods of my manufactured grief. Daniel had grown into a remarkable young man despite the traumatic circumstances of his early separation from me, and I was beginning to understand that my absence from his childhood hadn't damaged him in the ways I had feared. The Rodriguez family had provided him with stability, love, and opportunities that had allowed him to develop his interests and talents, to build friendships and pursue goals, to become someone I was genuinely proud to call my son.
My grief over missing his childhood was real and valid, but it didn't negate the positive outcomes that his adoptive family had created. The wedding itself was held in a beautiful outdoor venue in Portland, surrounded by gardens that provided a peaceful backdrop for celebrating love and commitment in the midst of our complicated family history. I stood beside Carmen as we walked Daniel down the aisle, both of us crying with pride and joy as we delivered him to Sarah, who was waiting with a smile that illuminated her entire face. The moment felt both deeply personal and somehow universal, a recognition that families can be created through choice and commitment as much as through biology and tradition. During the reception, I gave a speech that I had spent weeks writing and rewriting, trying to find words that would honor all the relationships that had shaped Daniel's life while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought us together. I talked about the power of love to survive deception and separation, about the possibility of creating beauty from brokenness, about the ways that truth can heal even when it initially causes pain. I thanked Miguel and Carmen for raising Daniel with such care and intention, for welcoming me into their family despite the complicated emotions involved, for showing all of us what generosity and grace look like in practice. Daniel's response to my speech was one of the most meaningful moments of my life, a public acknowledgement of our relationship that felt like a final healing of the wounds that Mark's deception had created. He talked about the confusion and anger he had felt upon learning the truth about his origins, but also about the gratitude he felt for having multiple families who loved him, for being surrounded by people who had chosen to support his happiness rather than compete for his loyalty. He thanked me for fighting to find him, for refusing to accept his supposed death as the end of our story, for having the courage to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than comfortable lies. As the evening continued, I found myself dancing with strangers who had become family, sharing stories and laughter with people whose lives had been forever changed by Mark's deception, but who had chosen to create something positive from the wreckage. The Rodriguez family's extended relatives had embraced me as one of their own, understanding that love multiplies rather than divides when it's shared generously. Sarah's family had done the same, welcoming all of Daniel's parents and relatives without trying to establish hierarchies or categories. The celebration felt like an affirmation of everything we had learned about family and resilience during the difficult years since discovering the truth. We had proven that relationships could survive devastating betrayals, that families could be reconstructed even after being torn apart by deception, that love could grow stronger when it was based on choice rather than obligation. The wedding wasn't just celebrating Daniel and Sarah's commitment to each other, it was celebrating all of our commitments to honesty, forgiveness, and the hard work of building authentic relationships. In the months following the wedding, I settled into a new rhythm of life that felt more authentic and sustainable than anything I had experienced during my marriage to Mark. My relationship with Daniel continued to deepen and evolve, moving beyond the initial shock of reunion into something that felt genuinely familiar. We talked regularly about both mundane daily concerns and deeper questions about identity, family, and the ways that trauma can be inherited and transcended. Our conversations were different from what they might have been if we had never been separated, but they were also honest and meaningful in ways that surprised both of us. I also continued my advocacy work with organizations focused on adoption reform and parental rights, using my experience to help other families navigate similar situations of deception and fraud. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying, providing a sense of purpose that transformed my pain into something that could help prevent others from experiencing similar betrayal. I testified before legislative committees, spoke at conferences, and consulted with lawyers and social workers who were dealing with cases that involved various forms of family-related deception. Through this work, I met other people whose lives had been shaped by elaborate lies told by family members, whose understanding of their own histories had been fundamentally altered by discovering long-hidden truths. There were adoptees who had been told their birth parents were dead when they were actually alive and searching, parents who had been convinced their children had died when they had actually been placed in witness protection, siblings who had been separated by lies about family safety and stability. The variety of deceptions was staggering, but the common thread was always the devastating impact of having your reality systematically manipulated by people you trusted. These conversations helped me understand that Mark's betrayal, while particularly elaborate and cruel, was part of a larger pattern of family-related deceptions that often went undetected for decades. The combination of legal loopholes, technological limitations, and social assumptions about family privacy had created systems that could be exploited by people willing to lie on a massive scale. My case had received significant media attention partly because of its extreme nature, but it had also highlighted vulnerabilities in adoption processes, vital records systems, and mental health documentation that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient motivation and resource. The legislative reforms that resulted from our case were modest but meaningful, creating additional safeguards for adoptions, requiring more rigorous verification of parental consent, and establishing clearer protocols for investigating suspicious circumstances in family separation. The changes wouldn't prevent all future deceptions, but they would make it harder for someone like Mark to successfully orchestrate such an elaborate fraud without being detected and stopped. I also worked with mental health professionals to develop better protocols for supporting families affected by major deceptions, helping therapists and counselors understand the unique challenges faced by people whose reality had been systematically manipulated over long periods. The psychological impact of discovering fundamental lies about your own life was different from other forms of trauma, requiring specialized approaches that acknowledged both the grief over what had been lost and the confusion about what was real. As I became more involved in this advocacy work, I began to understand my experience not just as a personal tragedy, but as part of a larger story about truth, trust, and the ways that families can both nurture and harm their members. Mark's deception had been uniquely cruel and elaborate, but it had also revealed systemic vulnerabilities that affected many families beyond our own. Working to address those vulnerabilities gave meaning to my suffering, transforming it from senseless victimization into purposeful action. Daniel and Sarah bought a house in Portland and invited me to visit regularly, creating space in their lives for ongoing relationship building that honored both our biology and our separate histories. Their home became a gathering place for our extended family network, hosting dinners and celebrations that included the Rodriguez family, Sarah's relatives, and the various friends and colleagues who had become important to all of us. These gatherings felt revolutionary in their inclusiveness, proving that families could be defined by love and choice rather than by traditional categories and hierarchies. I also began dating again for the first time since my divorce from Mark, cautiously exploring the possibility of romantic relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. The process was challenging because my experience with Mark had damaged my ability to trust my own judgment about people's character and motivation. I found myself constantly analyzing potential partners for signs of deception, questioning their stories and explanations in ways that sometimes felt excessive but also felt necessary for my psychological safety. The man I eventually began a serious relationship with was a fellow teacher named Robert, who had gone through his own experience with a deceptive spouse and understood the challenges of rebuilding trust after betrayal. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both of us committed to radical honesty about our pasts, our fears, and our hopes for the future. Robert had been married to a woman who had hidden a gambling addiction that had destroyed their finances and nearly cost them their home, and he understood the particular pain of discovering that someone you love has been systematically lying to you about fundamental aspects of their life. Building a relationship with Robert required me to practice skills I had never needed to develop during my marriage to Mark, articulating my needs and boundaries clearly, questioning narratives that seemed inconsistent or suspicious, trusting my own perceptions even when they conflicted with what I was being told. The process was exhausting at times, but it was also empowering in ways that surprised me. I was learning to be an active participant in my own life rather than a passive recipient of someone else's version of reality. Robert met Daniel in the extended family network during a Christmas celebration at Miguel and Carmen's house, and I watched nervously as he navigated the complex dynamics and relationships that had become normal for us, but might seem overwhelming to an outsider. But Robert approached the situation with curiosity and respect, asking thoughtful questions about our history without trying to simplify or fix anything, understanding that our family structure was complicated but functional in ways that didn't need to be changed or improved. The holiday celebration itself felt like a culmination of everything we had learned about love, forgiveness, and resilience since discovering the truth about Daniel's supposed death. We were gathered around a table that included biological relatives, adoptive family members, chosen family, and new partners, all of us connected by our shared commitment to supporting each other's happiness and growth. The conversation flowed easily between English and Spanish, between stories about the past and plans for the future, between serious discussions about family dynamics and lighthearted jokes about holiday traditions. Daniel and Sarah announced during that dinner that they were expecting their first child, and the room erupted in celebration as we all absorbed the news that our family was about to expand again. I would become a grandmother, Carmen and Miguel would become grandparents again, and the child would grow up surrounded by an extended network of relatives who had learned to love generously and inclusively. The pregnancy felt like a new beginning, a chance to create positive family experiences that weren't overshadowed by deception and trauma. As I held Sarah's hand and felt the baby kicking inside her belly, I was overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. Mark's betrayal had stolen 20 years from Daniel and me, had caused immeasurable pain and confusion for everyone involved, but it had also led us to discover our own strength and resilience. We had learned that families could survive devastating betrayals, that love could grow stronger when it was based on choice rather than obligation, that truth was always preferable to comfortable lies. The baby was born on a sunny morning in May, a healthy girl whom Daniel and Sarah named Elena Carmen Thompson, honoring both the Rodriguez family and my maiden name in recognition of the complex family history that had shaped all of our lives. I was in the delivery room when she was born, holding Sarah's hand while Carmen coached her through the final pushes, and when Elena opened her eyes for the first time, I saw traces of Daniel's infant face looking back at me. Holding my granddaughter for the first time felt like completing a circle that had been broken by Mark's deception but had finally been repaired through persistence, love, and the willingness to face difficult truths. Elena would grow up knowing the full story of her family's history, understanding that love could survive separation and betrayal, that truth was always worth pursuing even when it was painful to discover. She would be raised by parents who had learned to value honesty above comfort, surrounded by relatives who had chosen to support each other despite complex and sometimes difficult dynamics. As I write this final part of our story, Elena is learning to walk, taking tentative steps between the various family members who are always ready to catch her when she falls. She moves easily between English and Spanish, between different houses and different relatives, comfortable with complexity in ways that remind me of Daniel's own adaptability and resilience. Watching her explore her world with curiosity and confidence fills me with hope for the future, for the possibility that the next generation will be less burdened by secrets and deceptions than previous ones have been. Mark was released from prison last month after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence, but he has made no attempt to contact any of us. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved to a different state and is working in a job that doesn't require background checks, trying to rebuild his life away from the wreckage of his crime. I feel no curiosity about his current situation, no desire to know whether he has learned from his mistakes or found ways to make amends for the harm he caused. My energy is focused entirely on the family we have created together, on the relationships that are based on truth rather than deception. The advocacy work continues to be an important part of my life, providing opportunities to help other families navigate similar situations, while working to prevent future deceptions through legislative and systemic reform. But the work feels different now that my personal healing has progressed, less driven by anger and pain, and more motivated by hope and the desire to protect others from unnecessary suffering. I speak regularly at conferences and training sessions, sharing our story as an example of both the devastating impact of family deception and the possibility of healing and growth in its aftermath. Daniel graduated from a master's program in engineering and now works for a company that designs renewable energy systems, applying his technical skills to projects that might help address climate change and environmental degradation. He talks often about wanting to leave the world better than he found it, to use his talents in service of causes larger than himself. I see in his career choices the same sense of purpose that has driven my advocacy work, the desire to transform personal experience into positive action that benefits others. Sarah has returned to her teaching career after maternity leave, and she often asks for my advice about classroom management and curriculum development. Our conversations about education have become one of my favorite aspects of our relationship, connecting us through shared professional interests, while also giving me opportunities to support her goals and development. She has become not just Daniel's wife but genuinely my daughter-in-law, someone I care about independently of her connection to my son. The Rodriguez family remains central to all of our lives, with Miguel and Carmen serving as Elena's primary babysitters, and Miguel teaching Daniel woodworking skills in the garage workshop he has set up in their new house. Their generosity and inclusiveness continue to amaze me, their ability to expand their definition of family to include people who might have been seen as competitors or threats in other circumstances. They have shown all of us what unconditional love looks like when it's practiced consistently over time. As this story reaches its conclusion, I want to acknowledge that healing from major deception is not a linear process with a clear endpoint. There are still days when I feel overwhelmed by anger about the time that was stolen from Daniel and me, still moments when I struggle to trust my own perceptions about people and situations. The psychological impact of discovering that your entire reality was fabricated doesn't disappear just because you've rebuilt your life on a foundation of truth. But I have learned that healing doesn't require the complete absence of pain or the total resolution of complex emotion. It requires the willingness to keep moving forward despite ongoing challenges, to build meaningful relationships even when trust feels risky, to find purpose and joy even in the midst of processing loss and trauma. Most importantly, it requires the commitment to choose truth over comfort, honesty over convenience, authentic connection over superficial peace. Our story is not one of simple redemption or easy forgiveness. Mark's crimes cannot be undone, and the time he stole from us cannot be recovered. But our story is one of resilience and the power of love to survive even the most devastating betrayal. We have learned that families can be reconstructed even after being torn apart, that trust can be rebuilt even after being shattered, that truth is always worth pursuing, even when it threatens comfortable illusion. For anyone who might be reading this while facing their own discovery of family deception, I want you to know that healing is possible even when it seems impossible, that truth is always preferable to lies even when it's initially more painful, that you have the strength to rebuild your life on an authentic foundation even if you don't believe it yet. The journey is difficult and often overwhelming, but it leads to relationships and experiences that are more genuine and sustainable than anything built on deception could ever be. Elena is calling for her grandmother now, reaching her tiny arms toward me from her high chair, while babbling in the mixture of sounds that will eventually become words. In a few minutes I'll pick her up and carry her outside to the garden, where we'll look at flowers and birds while I tell her stories about the family that loves her, the complex history that shaped all of our lives, and the bright future that stretches ahead of us. She won't understand the words yet, but she'll feel the love and security that surrounds her, the product of our collective commitment to honesty, forgiveness, and the hard work of building authentic relationships. This is how healing happens, not through forgetting or minimizing what was done to us, but through choosing to create something beautiful from the wreckage, to love generously despite having been betrayed, to tell the truth even when lies would be more comfortable. Mark tried to destroy our family through deception, but we have built something stronger and more resilient in its place, something that can't be undermined by lies because it's founded on truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.